Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Diane Taylor, Director of Public Programs here at the National Building Museum. Through exhibitions and public programs, the museum presents its mission to inspire curiosity and wonder about the world we design and build. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize and thank our program sponsors, the Anthony and Keiko Greenberg Foundation, as well as KCCT, who are this year celebrating 40 years of enduring design. For more than 2 decades, the museum's signature series, Spotlight on Design, has presented design luminaries and legends in architecture, landscape architecture, and urban planning. Spotlight on Design celebrates the creative work and unique journeys of voices that shape and characterize our built environment. We're so pleased to have KCCT's President and Principal Architect, John Chapman, here with us tonight. Public programs would not be possible without support and sponsorship. We thank you for making it possible to celebrate the practice of architecture, the built environment, and its relevance to us all. We welcome you to share a few words.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you all for coming out on a winter evening to help us celebrate our 40th anniversary. We actually have a long relationship with this building. Not everyone knows that we did a lot of the early renovation on the project, including the site, the corner monuments, and renovation of 16 of the galleries. We are known for collaborating with other firms, both on the architecture side and the engineering side. And one of our favorite firms that we've collaborated with over the years is WEISS MANFREDI. So it is my pleasure to introduce Marion WEISS and Michael MANFREDI, very good friends, peers, and colleagues. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Diane, and thanks to everybody for being here this evening. It is really an honor and a thrill for us to be invited to speak as part of the Spotlight on Design series. And what's exciting for us is that the National Building Museum has for many years, certainly all of our years as architects, represented that commitment to somehow showcasing what design and architecture can do, and bringing the kind of cross-disciplinary threads of possibilities and opportunities, and even looking at pressing challenges as opportunities to move forward. So for us, what we're grateful for this evening is that our collaborator here, John Chapman, and KCCT sponsoring this series, is to say that we are collaborating with the built environment, which has been around a lot longer than we have when we are designers. There's so much to respect about the place that we are working in, and so much to learn about the communities that we're building for. We began our practice with a frustration that there was so much disciplinary separation between architecture, landscape, ecology, and urbanism. And particularly now, as social and natural realms are increasingly eroded, it really is an opportunity now to say, how can we look very closely at what design can do and offer to the public realm?
So we hope to create architecture that bridges divides between landscape and infrastructure, art and ecology, and to create connections where separations have existed. Now, more than ever, we must prioritize forging connections through design. So this evening we'll show 11 projects that have a very loose chronological trajectory over the past couple of decades. So you'll get, hopefully, a flavor for what we have been passionate about and what we continue to be passionate about. And that sense of wonder, I think, is something that I think is very much in this very beautiful image of the Nazca lines in Peru, a very ancient and enigmatic carving of the land, to understand a kind of larger cosmos. And that sense of the cosmos, our place in the cosmos, and the sense of change has also been very beautifully played out in this spiral jetty sculpture on Smithson. And that sense of how we see ourselves in the world is certainly coming very much to the fore. It's becoming a much more fragile world. A world where the agency of design, now more than ever, is critical, whether it's architecture, landscape, engineering. The syntheses of all these disciplines, I think, is what is something that drives us. And no longer can we think about design as a kind of utopian vision, an idea that these problems can be solved in a sort of single stroke, so to speak. Rather, we look for the kind of synthesis of a kind of architecture that responds to nature and to landscape, and similarly, a landscape that responds to architecture as a way of addressing larger issues. And this has been a preoccupation for us for quite some time, including a series of books that we produced that talk about the agency of design. So we'll talk about a couple projects that sort of fall loosely under the rubric of evolving infrastructures.
And evolving infrastructures becomes a very interesting paradigm to think about really time and place. And the Venice Biennale was an opportunity where we were invited to actually identify the threads of what make infrastructure something that has resonance in the design world for communities rather than just for vehicles. And so we actually decided not only just to showcase our own work, but to look back in time at models of projects that had enduring legacies, many of them thousands of years in time, hundreds of years in time, and bring those two worlds, our inspiration from them and our own work together, and look at those possibilities as always open-ended and inviting in new interpretations. And it was that very dialogue in this ancient building in Venice that was so moving for us to see people coming through and discovering the Kaju Bridge in Isfahan, the Agrasankivoli stepwell in India, and also our own preoccupations. And here you can see the model of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden project that we'll talk about further. And we are excited in the fall, our next book will be coming out, which is really looking at drifting symmetries, so that the worlds of architecture and landscape have seemed so bifurcated, in our minds do better when they drift together and apart to open up new meanings. But we'll begin maybe our portfolio that we're going to share some selected projects from with where our beginning came from, which was the Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. This was a competition that for us was really an amazing question of how one could look at this remarkable landscape of urban design, of Arlington Cemetery on axis with Memorial Bridge, but also look at a forlorn history of a site that had been, in a sense, neglected, and also a community, 2 million women who had served in the military who had never been honored. And so for us, it was really the question of how could we imagine a structure that was just a retaining wall and a community that had not actually had a chance to pass through barriers or walls. How could they come together to create a place of commemoration and engagement, a place of prospect, a place where their words and words about them could be carved and inscribed in an enduring manner, and in fact that the sunlight might actually pass through those words and allow those stories to become either in focus or ephemeral depending on the passage of light. And yet those intimate stories could then now join the kind of collection of monuments in Washington and forever be part of that enduring story that is monumental Washington. And so we're really honored to know that we're going to be looking forward to working on the Sylvan Theater Trust for the National Mall, accomplished 1 years later, that is, we hope soon to begin to enable anything from Sixth Amendment to up to 10,000 for the William Tell Overture to be able to be welcomed by the shade of a grove and to actually be, in fact, embraced in the landscape of Washington as a place of discovery and of theater.
There is a slight sense of deja vu and the passage of time. Women's Memorial actually had, the National Building Museum had an exhibition of the competition entries in the corner. It was our very first chance to exhibit work. So the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which we started over a decade ago was an opportunity to really test our passion and our interest in the intersection of architecture and landscape. It's a beautiful oasis in the city that is part of a kind of larger network of open spaces, but crucial to the communities that it serves. And the challenge was to kind of greet and invite the kind of larger public, the underserved public, into a very beautiful garden and an oasis that for many, many years had been sort of conceptually off limits. So how to kind of bring the sort of city, the kind of interweaving of the city and the garden, which you see in these early origami study models, how to bring that and give it measure, give it kind of an architectural presence. So we actually took the idea of this visitor center and instead of pulling it to the center of the garden, brought it right out to the street so that there would be a sense of invitation, of welcome. The idea that the Botanic Garden is a place for discovery, regardless of where you're coming from or where you live. It's a sense that the building is engaged in its topography. We hope at times the building disappears. As it fronts the street, it's much more architectural in its expression. You can literally slide right through the building without going into it. And yet it accommodates a number of different routes that make the Brooklyn Botanic Garden such a beautiful place, a kind of living museum. And that museum, I think, here, for example, the building adjusts to the drip line of a very rare green cherry tree, one of the most rare cherry trees. So again, the idea that the building is in deference to the landscape that surrounds it. At times you can go into the building and learn a little bit more about the intersection of botany and biology. There are places where the community can host events, whether they're formal events, as you see set up here for a lecture, or more formal, informal events. You can approach the building from both sides, so it becomes a bit of a kind of Mobius, and you can slide through, capture views both of the building and the garden, and at times take in the sort of fifth facade, which is really this kind of green roof, that with time changes over the course of the seasons, and it's now changed quite a bit over the last 10 years. But the building is also a hard-working building. It has a performative quality. It gathers water, stores it, keeps it so that we can use it for irrigation during what is becoming an increasingly dry and hot climate cycle. At times, the building is very much about the garden rather than about architecture. And at times, even in the garden, particularly in kind of a cool evening, it has a kind of very strong architectural presence. It's lantern-like, I suppose. And then here you see it in a very, very different perspective. So we love the chameleon-like quality that architecture can bring. We were fortunate just recently to come back and work on one of the sort of simplest challenges that architecture can engage, which is how to make spaces more inclusive, more open, more accessible. So you can see the kind of typical condition, a ramp. But this was an opportunity to take a slope that had been too steep to create a garden around and try to combine for us the sense of accessibility and a garden. So here we created this 400-foot long meandering path with a series of views. So it becomes a kind of extended Villa Dede. And it engages the visitor center 10 years later, essentially reestablishing that role that the visitor center played, which is to melt literally into the garden. So you can start to see how the ramp is much more than just a ramp. It's a place to stop. It's a place to kind of essentially capture different views of the garden itself. And that sense of time, that passage of time, is, I think, the kind of choreography that we'll talk a little bit about in some of our other projects. During COVID, this became an especially important, psychologically, physically, very important place to be.
So as Michael mentioned, during COVID, this was in fact a very important place to be, but the real question is, how do we create social infrastructures, especially as we know they can become so fragile? And in our book, Public Natures, we talked about that, and in our academic work, we have been very interested in creating social infrastructures rather than just kind of programmatically clear buildings. The Singh Center for Nanotechnology couldn't have been more hermetic in its program with the clean room microscopy suites. Yet our question was, if we think about Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania as places that have evolved around their landscapes, those landscapes can become defining ways to actually lock a place into its setting and to give it another dimension. And so as we circled around this landscape to create a courtyard that had never been in the engineering area, we were able to then take something that is usually invisible, just seen through a tiny portal and a door in amber color, and actually make that a complete amber wall to kind of keep the infrared light out of the clean room activities that are going on, and yet not keep those people in the labs also connected with what's happening outside. So these kind of lenses then become places of question and ideally discovery, so that Penn's program not only welcomes graduates and regional scientists, but is also welcoming future innovators, we hope. But that real question is, what does it mean in all those thin spaces in a lab building? Well, they have to have 20 feet high floor to floor. That's a tough thing. But if we could make an irresistible staircase, and on that staircase create highly generous landings for collaboration, lots of plugging in goes on there, that maybe that journey of connection is not just expedient, but one where, in fact, a new social infrastructure is possible. The idea of being able to see and be seen gives you a sense that people who are even not in your discipline might be within reach, and even maybe out of reach, with this enormous cantilever hovering over this new green, is that sense that science is not hidden and not private, but also one that wants to be part of the academic world and also part of the larger city. And that urban presence and that kind of very small scale microscopy characterization work is one that what we like is that sense of motion is seen in many ways by those in passing as something that might make them wonder about the engineering marvels inside or outside. Inside, the connection between the labs and the collaboration spaces are ideally with a 24-hour life illuminating that academic pursuit of innovation. Now, innovation at an architecture school becomes another question, and this is at the Kent State Center for Architecture and Environmental Design. And what was so interesting for us in Kent, Ohio, was recognizing that that's a very different landscape, not so much urban, but really tied to something that has had a loft-like flexibility in the kind of factory buildings that we admired. And while many of them had been lost over time, for us, they were sources of inspiration. Because when we start to think about what architecture studios are about, they really are about this kind of collaborative, loft-like environment where anything can happen. And yet when we think about it, where we're trying to tie a city back to its academy, this 300-foot long building does something interesting. It kneels down in height to connect with the height of all the academic buildings and reaches up to the height of the urban buildings nearby. And in so doing, that idea of this diaphanous crystalline loft for studio spaces is in fact a symbolic nod to the fact that this is a building that is a 24-hour building on campus. And it is one where that sense of descending out but still reaching and being a luminous beacon is tied in to the way this reads as a place to be urban inside along 300 feet. There's access then to the studio spaces, and those studio spaces are really a place of prospect, a place where whether you're first year or third year or fourth year or interiors or environmental design, all those disciplines are seen literally as being in one room. And that one room is one on the first day of the first semester it was opened. It looked a little, how shall we say, restrained in its flamboyance, and now it's looking a lot more like we know and we like architecture studios to look, which is really a mess. And yet the library is quite remarkable. It also has a materials library that you can see in that white cube beyond, and Belden Brick donates a lot to that, and so much so that we were really excited about actually trying to take the palette of the town and the city, and that brick, which is very intimate, and actually work with Belden to rejuvenate what had yet to be fired up in a while, which was their beehive kiln, because it was producing imperfect bricks, some dark, some light, and we said we love it. And we added one more shade to the palette to create this kind of tactile reading of the building that literally could give you that material sense of how this is created, one that could change with the glass by light and by day, and more importantly, hopefully become a place where those who are interested in joining an exploration of architecture and environmental design would know that this is a place where it happens.
So to continue the conversation about how to create, we hope, opportunities for connections, particularly in academic and lab buildings. This was a new campus that was kind of sort of inaugurated by the Bloomberg administration in New York City on Roosevelt Island, and it was a kind of a Cornell Tech, a sort of startup that would sort of be an incubator for the traditional academic departments and entrepreneurial startups. What an opportunity to build on an island, a very thin island with extraordinary views both east and west. So for us, it was an opportunity to kind of capitalize on that. So we were given this kind of sort of fat, lumpy site, and the first thing we said was, well, how can we ensure that everyone will get views of both sides of the river? So we took the building and in a way reshaped the program so that there was a kind of set of common spaces that provided a sense of democracy, so everyone would get a view. Also coming out of the kind of research that we're all dealing with, which is climate change and rising sea levels, we hoisted the building so it had the kind of piano nobile above the sort of FEMA flood line, placed all the sensitive equipment well above that. So it has a sort of topography that we hope is responsive, not only to generate a series of intimate connections through circulation, but also recognizes some of the challenges that we're facing environmentally. So there's a thread of circulation that goes all the way through the building up to the top. And likewise, you can sort of say the building spills out into its kind of open courtyard, so that, again, there's that reciprocity between inside and outside. So you come into the building through effectively an interior piazza that various disciplines, and it's also, by the way, open to the public. So we love the idea that a future scientist might wander into the building. You can climb up through the more public areas, always within sight. And then kind of one of the crowning jewels is this multi-level studio where different programs, different teams can get together and through computation, because it's primarily around computational sciences, can talk about social problems and social issues that can be solved, hopefully. There are areas for smaller gatherings with extraordinary views of the river. And at times the building feels like it's sort of floating in anticipation, perhaps, of very, very significant change. And then finally, we're up onto the roof where it's a little over 40,000 square feet of solar panels that help contribute power to the campus itself, and a very, very beautiful shaded area. So it's our hope that you would read this building, which is, while it looks all glass, is 60% opaque, in a way is a kind of contemporary analog to the beautiful 19th century engineering that is the Queensboro Bridge.
And somehow, maybe, this engineering thread is in the air everywhere today, but at the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, within the engineering quad, there was a dream to say there are some things that are not quite bound within engineering that are going to benefit from collaboration with folks at the engineering school. And so the interesting thing about this particular query was that they wanted to create a very petite building, 12,000 square feet, to say it wasn't going to be scripted with traditional labs, but for places for conversations and projects. Now, looking at this, you could say, well, where is the site? Because it's wedged between this incredible Brutalist building and the traditional Yale Collegiate Gothic buildings. And yet, we were kind of excited when we were first asked to connect to one of the buildings around. We said, why don't we actually take the roof of this lab building that's one story underneath and turn it into a new garden and a place for this conversation to happen. And so we literally started drawing almost a bubble diagram in the middle, actually trying to give breathing room to all the buildings around, but also thinking about a new campus quad, because so much of what makes Yale unique are the quads. And so thinking about it and conceiving it as it is no longer just a lost hardscape behind the back of every building, but perhaps a central green, that we had to do some surgery here. Here's Breuer's huge retaining walls between one of the traditional courtyards on campus and then the roofscape, if you will. And so by thinking about taking these walls down, we began to think about creating a connected topographic landscape, one that could enable the Sci Center to be a prow or literally a kind of a light bulb in the heart of the engineering world. And again, we were of course intrigued by the engineering opportunity to have a vertical span of glass that's 22 feet tall, and it's freestanding and self-supporting. If anybody holds a curved piece of paper, you know it could hold itself up. If you had it flat, it would fall over. And so the structural amazement of the simple curvature of this glass enable us to have a fully transparent yet spectrally selective room. Now, sometimes the sun is strong, and so being able to have these on a kind of a controlled system where these curtains could be deployed, or when there's a desire to have a private conference, enables this prospect of open and close to take on a life of its own. And yet, more importantly, though, because in the evening there are special events, there's no way that you can miss the idea of the Edison bulb somehow in the heart of campus being the place where that talk is happening. And so it's one that in many ways has reinvented a landscape and also created a there between the incredible tapestry of styles. And for us, because we so admire the Breuer building to its side and the collegiate Gothic beyond, we love the coincidence that somehow the curved glass makes the brutalist building look very collegiate Gothic in reflection.
So I have to tell you, it's really scary to present a project when your clients are in the room. So, I think we're very proud to be working on this project, which is in many ways a project of a lifetime. We were drawn very much to the traditions of India, Mughal architecture, the relationship of gardens, garden walls, the relationship between the architecture and taking water, which is increasingly precious. 400 or 500 years ago, water was treated in an equally precious way. So lessons to be learned. We were also very fortunate to be working next to Edward Durell-Stone's probably greatest building, his chancery in Delhi, which in itself has a very important history relative to America's democracy and its presentation of that democracy. It's an extraordinarily challenging site. Many buildings, some of them in very, very good shape, some of them not. So part of our master plan was to identify how growth could occur and how some buildings could be saved and others that were in bad shape could slowly be put to better use. But the idea was, rather than just make architecture, is to sort of look for the thread that would connect both new and existing buildings, a kind of a way of using, with a light touch, like acupuncture, a sense of connectivity, that sort of sense that we as human beings want to kind of find ways to connect. So there's a sort of a linear garden, a kind of the French would call it a tapis vert, a green carpet that becomes the connective tissue for both new and renovated and buildings to remain. So this is the ultimate build-out, which hopefully will occur in our lifetime. But again, it's a chance for us to think about the beauty of Indian architecture, where the wall is not seen as a way of pushing someone away, but rather a way of marking territory with increasingly important activity. So you can start to see the development of using walls that are important not only for security, but also ways of defining spaces in very, hopefully, beautiful ways. Also, we were certainly in love with the idea of using, in this case, the onyx trees to provide shade. Delhi is an extraordinary experiment, a laboratory for where all of us will be. Extreme heat, torrential rains, and the cycle keeps going. So it's an attempt, I think, to reconcile not only diplomacy, but also climate change, which is increasingly important to our diplomatic missions. So we are capturing water rather than it just evaporating it, using it for storage. It's a sectional building, very much pushed down so that it always, in a way, defers to the beautiful Edward Durham stone building. And you can start to see how some of the lower levels actually use the earth when things are very hot to kind of stay a little bit cooler. There are representational spaces that are given a certain level of prominence to the materials, but also the development of a kind of jolly screen system that allows us to temper this very harsh daily light and still provide the kind of views. You can start to see the kind of experiments that we worked with the OBO on. And then the kind of sketches that Marion and I always try to do to somehow find that kind of emotive quality that makes buildings loved, or the kind of building that you want to be in. So here, the sense of water being very important and using water in very strategic ways, but thin surface. And at times, again, that kind of green carpet that connects both new and old, we hope will be a place of discovery and wonder. So in a similar vein, and perhaps more recently, while Florida is not India, it increasingly is subjected to the kind of climate cycles. So we were fortunate to be working on a museum in Florida that was actually damaged during Hurricane Irma. And you can start to see the kind of destructive forces that we, as a culture, are going to be seen with greater frequency. But it was also a museum that I think was in the tradition of keeping everyone out. So you can start to see that in red, there was a sort of sense of the museum being almost mausoleum-like. And these are areas that were also much more heavily damaged during Hurricane Irma. So we took those down on the belief that sometimes less architecture can make a bigger statement. So the idea was to sometimes take structures out to create places to convene. But again, this sort of giant bubble tended to bifurcate what for us was a very beautiful courtyard, potentially beautiful courtyard, and because it was so damaged, okay, thank you. It allowed us to create an open space where the community in Florida could gather, host events, and this again became an extremely important space to host musical events during COVID, to be outside. Also the recognition that a courtyard like this can have a function well beyond the kind of 5 o'clock when typically the museum used to close up. It's a place where the kind of new and old, the addition to the museum and the recladding, are seen in this one area where there's a sort of sensuous curve that allows you to go up into the galleries. Again, take in views as you're going from gallery to gallery. Or in this case, because it's a sort of a multidisciplinary building, it has places for small concerts. And you can see, I think our musicians are completely masked. There isn't a single soul in this room, but we've now been able to go back. The galleries are I think, like many galleries, are treated as more neutral envelopes with good lighting and comfortable spaces between the gallery and the more public areas. And then we love the idea that this building can be approached both from the north and the south. So if the earlier images were from the south, with this expansive courtyard, from the north, it's a more intimate connection back into that courtyard and up into the building. So again, sense that the building is a bit of a chameleon and has many, many different aspects depending on its particular context.
So this idea of a chameleon building and even a chameleon site really came into focus for us at the Olympic Sculpture Park. Because in this case, Seattle's waterfront has been chameleon-like. It's strangled from the city from the water's edge through infrastructure. And over time, the burden of highways, train tracks, a failing seawall, in this case a 40-foot grade change, became a place where you could say only the cultural institution of a museum could see great possibility to create a sculpture park, not one, but 3 sites. We were super excited about this improbable and impossible question that they had said, and began to think about something that could become an earthwork that would wander from the city to the water's edge. Now, easier said than done. I mean, they needed to reduce salmon habitat, handle seismically. It was a completely contaminated site. And we also had a federal high-body, wide-body trucking route going right through it. Now, all of those became things that we wanted to understand systemically but also understand systemically how nature and ecology could restore this site and how sculpture and ecology could be seen together. 200,000 cubic yards of earth later, this topography enabled us to create really intimate and varied landscapes and actually elongate a journey to the water's edge. And in so doing, utilize some of the kind of engineering and cost-effective ways that highway builders use with mechanically stabilized earth, and in this case, overlapping precast walls that can handle the seismic disturbances on site. And yet that idea of this not being so much a named park, but about the Olympic Mountains in the distance, enabled the names of Calder and Outlook to really become the stars. Just as we thought about the building as the site as an unfolding diorama of nature and infrastructure and water's edge coming together, so too is the pavilion itself, a kind of Kunsthal. And as we think about that Kunsthal, it really is, again, seen in perspective from the point that is dead center over the road, and from that dead center position takes you to the water's edge. And even those trucks that are coming through the site have a chance to say that they've visited the sculpture park. And so too the Amtrak trains that go all the way up to Vancouver can say that they have been to the sculpture park. And Teresita Fernandez's beautiful piece, Seattle Cloud Cover, was something that we were able to frame as a kind of passage and experience when one comes across that train track. And yet what became really exciting for us was to get 2 federal grants. In fact, it was the museum that got these grants for salmon restoration and habitat. And rather than deal with the failing seawall, in fact, it was a possibility of creating a new subsurface earthwork for salmon habitat, which is now, in fact, it's for juvenile salmon, which apparently they love to hang out in these kind of shallow areas, as does chub, so it's really now become an ongoing research site that the University of Washington has been monitoring. And yet for us, it's that real possibility of drawing the community together through the lens of art to change a piece of the city and to change everybody's relationship and understanding of art not being a place where you have to be knowledgeable to approach it, but in fact to be part of life and part of your life and part of the life of the city. And so there's a film that hopefully will work that gives you a sense of it as a site in motion at all times, and is one where the dog walkers are as welcome as the art lovers. Inside the pavilion, that Kunsthal environment is one that's ever changing. And outside, there is ideally an invitation to hang out on the terrace or take this very delayed rather than expedient journey to the water's edge. Richard Serra did this beautiful piece called Wake in the base of the valley. And what we love, I think, the most is that the sounds of the city and the trains are always defining any visit to the sculpture park.
So this is, you'll see a few recent projects that we'll close this lecture with. Longwood Gardens, which some of you know is outside of Wilmington, is a very beautiful garden developed by Pierre Dupont, kind of historic references. And our task was to create a new, very large greenhouse and a series of other structures in a way to kind of bring the garden into the sort of next century. So you can start to see it here. And our plan was to consolidate many of the greenhouses that were failing and actually not in very, very good shape, and to consolidate them into one large greenhouse, probably about the size of this room. So it's really quite large. And out of that kind of came a deep respect for the sort of sense that Longwood was as much about the architecture as it was the landscape. So we worked very hard to kind of think about the architecture and its engineering as a nod, I suppose, a way of acknowledging the beautiful structure. So you can see some of these earlier sketches take that sense of the architecture and the structure being very much like trees. It's sitting on a pool of water that uses, that is always recirculated and used for irrigation. Sort of the sense that water is precious. It also allows us, working with Reed Hildebrand, or are extraordinarily talented landscape architects, to think about the vegetation that we might want to encourage over the next several decades. Vegetation either thrives when things are very, very wet or when they're very, very dry. So the sense of water, vegetation, and architecture collaborating under this very large conservatory was something that interested us, as well as the sort of sense that we could keep the geometry of the building and make an acknowledgement to the very beautiful landscapes beyond of the Brandywine. There are many, many, many different kinds of programs and ways in which we can, in some cases, restore the water lily court. But it's also a way of thinking about a conservatory, which is generally a consumer of great energy, as a sort of living, breathing, perhaps much more energy efficient building. So you can start to see how we're storing water, how the sort of gills of the building can open up so there's no air conditioning. We can use the natural resources of the earth or ventilation to keep the building cool. And you can start to see probably an image taken not so long ago, so exciting, the building will open in the fall. And it's an extraordinary piece of construction. I think we're very grateful to be working with Bancroft Construction. They're doing an extraordinary job. And you can start to see the silhouette, which has a kind of topography. Again, it recalls the kind of Brandywine landscape. And then, of course, at night, we're hoping that it has a kind of lantern-like quality, often associated perhaps with Japanese lanterns.
So as a thesis, I would say, that has been running through our practice, which is that connection to landscape and architecture, has also had to do with the kind of sustainability now as we think about rising sea levels. And so Hunters Point South Waterfront Park is one where what was super interesting about what had simply been an old factory, place of manufacturing, was one that had one of the most amazing views back to Manhattan and prospects north and south. But it had an interesting yet sort of lost history. It used to be a place of wetlands, and it was then a place of industry, and then it effectively became an abandoned site. So when you start to think about the vulnerability of these water's edges, and in the case of certainly all the water's edges in New York Harbor, there is already, in the case of the East River, a 6-foot tidal surge issue every day, twice. And then on top of that, you can see with Hurricane Sandy the vulnerability of that whole edge. And so looking at this particular site became an interesting question, along with Era and T. Balsley, was what could this be if it really became a new place of the largest affordable housing units that had been done since the 60s and 70s? And what could it be that was also a destination for everyone, by ferry and by foot and by subway? So creating a new green infrastructure, porous streets, and making the edge of that park the destination before the development would happen, became a very interesting idea of a social infrastructure, but one that would be highly resilient and one that would be able to accept and welcome flooding. And you can see really what it looks like in flood condition here and what it looks like typically, and design this so that its resilience would be enduring. And yet it also is a playing field for the school across the street. And that kind of recreational identity is one that is also complemented by something that the program brief had called for 4 structures: a shade structure, a concession stand, a maintenance building, and restrooms. And we said, why not one building? And that is all in service of reaching out so that the ferry has a place to enable people to be sheltered, as does the concession building. And you can start to see that ferry there as that place of exchange, literally across the land mass of Manhattan and Long Island. And yet what becomes interesting is how can it do more work? It collects water in the pleats, it gathers solar energy on the southern facing side of the pleat, and it also then, in fact, becomes emblematically in this first phase image of the park, the kind of locus of the activities that happen here. The abandoned, what was called Water Taxi Beach, we rejuvenated as a beach for families. And again, the rails that used to be part of this place of exchange have now been turned into a new garden. And the idea of this armature, this kind of infrastructural lens, could look out and frame views of Manhattan like no other. And of course, we guided the centerpiece of this view back to the Empire State Building. And yet, it was from this prospect that we had to put the project on pause for 5 years. The drawings went in the drawer because funding would enable the second phase, and we were so thrilled and grateful that what had looked unpromising off in the prospect could become phase 2.
So phase 2 is an opportunity for us, our engineers, TVA Balsley, to kind of really test out the idea of a soft edge, a kind of sponge that could accommodate changing sea levels. And there's also the sense of a prospect, creating public spaces, truly public spaces, that you see in the kind of sketches that Marion and I did, kind of a larger Belvedere overlooking the river, looking both north and south. Of course, to build that is, I think, it's one thing to sketch it, it's another to build it. But again, working with Arab engineering, it was an opportunity to kind of really think about this as almost maritime construction. In fact, it was built in Maine and then shipped down to New York and hoisted. So the sense of constructability for us is also an opportunity that needs to be embedded in how a design is conceived. There's a kind of great moment where this giant platform, again, almost boat building construction, finds itself out over the water. And there's this sort of zone that Marion talked about in the kind of overall master plan that becomes this sort of soft infrastructure. It's both liquid, vegetative, and at times very architectural. These are the grasses that typically one would have found along the river's edge 200 or 300 years ago. It was also an opportunity to kind of recreate an island that, depending on the kind of tide cycles, is either a peninsula or an island. And then you can start to see how we're hoping that this will make a whole series of public events, public spaces, like a series of sort of charms on a necklace. And we'll show this movie that, and by the way, we're very interested in ambient sounds. Architecture tends to be visual. We forget the power of a foghorn, the sound and the texture of someone walking on gravel. That's not me, by the way.
And so I think the real question here on projects like this is really how can we have enduring values come into fore when we think about landscape, architecture, and history together. And yet in the next project, that sense of history is one that goes deeper back. I think you're goes deeper in time. All right, collaboration here. As we think about what it means to think about deep time and to think about revealing histories, we were shocked when we were thinking about this La Brea Tar Pit's question about what it would mean to rejuvenate, add to a museum, and rejuvenate and add to a site, where in fact it's the largest paleontological urban active site in the world. In this case, this fossil is 55,000 years old to 10,000 years old. But the crazy part, it's in Los Angeles on Wilshire Boulevard. And if we think about Los Angeles as a place that's really very interested in fictions and wants to get to the future in a hurry, that juxtaposition and parallel path, when we think about what La Brea Tar Pits are, which is over 100 years ago, excavating for asphalt and oil, they found indeed mammoths, mastodons, short-faced bears, an incredible window into the Ice Age, the Pleistocene. Now, what's crazy about this is literally, LACMA, the museum, the art museum is right next door to active 362-day-year excavation and research going on. These are scientists, they're not there for Disney, for show. So what does it mean when you think about this? Wilshire Boulevard is a miracle mile of sorts, but not necessarily looking back on its past. And yet we love the craziness of what it would mean to see these two worlds together and look at all those landmarks, but also think about that deep history. And so it was the weaving together of these histories, environmental histories, ecological histories, and actually the history of Los Angeles with its strength in fiction as well, that made us look at the site itself in a few different ways. Active excavation on your upper circle or bubble is going on at all times. In the center, the museum and a cultural green of sorts is in the middle. And then on Wilshire Boulevard is that lake pit that everybody looks at and knows of as that legacy. And so we started to think about time, literally deep time, in an interesting way. And that question of, and no, we didn't come up with a scheme from 3 bubble diagrams, but it does kind of look like it. But the idea of thinking of triple loop here, of lenses that we could see time in different ways, but also loops by which we can be intensely involved in different worlds. And those worlds actually have a kind of geological and paleontological legacy to reveal, because deep underneath the site is the production of oil and asphalt, which is what all these animals were stuck in and then became perfectly preserved for our research. And if we look at that, what does it mean then? Well, it's enter anywhere and discover things in any way. The lake pit, which has been really hands-off, we think is really so, because it is so terrifying, is exactly the very thing that you would love to cross, because the methane bubbles rise, and in fact, you understand exactly how close you are to where that entrapment had happened. And indeed, being able to be sheltered or shaded, all the tarps we thought could go if there could be a more enduring shelter or cover to those research pits. And that shelter and cover could also help frame the community green. And so the expansion of the museum is what you see on your left, and the renovation of the historic Page Museum on the right, now connected together as a new open lens. And that new open lens is one that will bring light where the earthwork had concealed the incredible research and collection. And together, new and old would become now a place of revelation of that legacy and history, and access to a remarkable collection of over 2 million fossils. And yet the possibility of making those fossils something that we could see, that we could touch, that we could be near, is something that we have yet to have a space to do in the expansion will hopefully enable that. And yet it's a source of wonder. And so for us, that drum that you can see in the expansion is about also something where we can control a unique place where the mammoths and mastodons and the charismatic large-scale elements could also be seen both up close, and then knowing that this is Hollywood and at a distance, maybe there could be a film strip, if you will, at night from the community green of mammoths and mastodons roaming Los Angeles. But that idea of roaming is one where we look at what it is to create connections to the past, create opportunities for the community to appreciate what has been there and become part of the community through that legacy, and also become part of a larger urban territory that has hopefully an invitation for enduring wonder. And so we'll close with this last film, which is really in many ways benefiting from the strength of our Hollywood collaborators, Imaginary Forces, and in 90 seconds, hopefully give you a window of the past into the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.